Locating the Indigenous People of the Philippines by Nimrod L. Calde. Exploring the lives and history of Indigenous people in the Philippine Revolution by recognizing the Indigenous people rights and the shift of the ethnic popularity in the 1987 Philippine Constitution and the IPRA of 1997. The State and the Indigenous People. Nation-state model, which shapes and emphasizing the Indigenous people even if the pluralism is imperfect. So pluralism is a two or more state or system having the authority among their people. Thus, it still offers greater inclusivity and promotion among Indigenous people. The competition among the political groups is still a struggle for the Indigenous people and their rights. This relationship between the government of the Philippines and the Indigenous people community is still unstable, as they don't have the capacity to have an agreement to all things that Indigenous people and the government have to each other. The Indigenous people of the Philippines. It refers to various ethnic groups that have lived in an area for hundreds of years, saying that they are the first people to live and use that area. Indigenous people are all around the world. In the Philippines, they scattered from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Some are displaced due to the loss of land and others choose to live with the Kapatagans. Some are in mountains, far from the Kapatagans or modern people. They don't want to be associated with them. They are characterized by their distinct culture, language, which ties to their ancestral land and the place where they perform their traditional and culture, respectively. They are being recognized by their source of living by means of farming and gathering. They perform their rituals and have their beliefs even before the colonization of the Spaniards and the Americans.
The state policy of integration in IPs. The state policy of integration aimed to assimilate indigenous peoples into mainstream society, dating back to Spanish colonial reduction and American resettlement program. Law and policies sought modernization and assimilation, often disregarding indigenous identity. Later, efforts evolved to balance integration and rights preservation, but challenges and controversies persisted. And ang policy of integration o patakaran ng pagsasama. Basically, ito yung strategy ng gobyerno para isama ang mga indigenous people o mga katutubo sa mainstream na populasyon. Yung tipong maging parte sila ng normal na lipunan. History of indigenous people. Simula pa nung Spanish era, nagsimula na ito nung panahon ng mga Kastila. Yung policy of reduction or resettlement, parang pinipilit silang manirahan sa mga tiyak na lugar. At mas tumindi nung American era. Para sa mga Amerikano, kulang pa daw ang mga katutubo sa sibilisasyon para magsarili. Iniisip nila na mahihina ang mga katutubo at madaling maapi ng mga civilized na Kristiyano. Kaya ginawa nila ang mga bifurcated state, parang hinatin nila ang Pilipinas, yung mga Christian na lugar, unti-unting binigyan ng self-government, pero yung mga non-Christian na lugar, direkta pa rin sa control ng mga American officials. Ang goal nila ay modernize ang mga katutubo para maging katulad ng mga Kristiyano. Ang mga batas na ginawa ay ang Act No. 253 noong 1901. Itinayo ang Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes para imbestigahan ang mga katutubo at hanapan ng paraan para ma-advise sila sa civilization at material prosperity. And last, ang Act No. 2711 o Administrative Code of noong 1917. Mas malala ito. Binigyan ang mga provincial governors ng mga kapangyarihan na magtayo ng resettlement areas para ikulong ang mga katutubo. Ang intensyon ay modernize sila ay yung kahit sa pilitan. At in short, ng policy of integration ay ang paraan ng gobyerno mula sa panahon ng mga Kastila hanggang sa mga Amerikano para gawing modern at civilize ang mga katutubo at isama sila sa mainstream na lipunan. Madalas, sa pilitan ang paraan ng pagsasama na ito. Non-Christian tribes in Sector 705 are responsible for promoting the advancement and integration of non-Christian Filipinos by fostering their moral, economic, social, and political development, aiming for unity, and mutual understanding with Christian Filipinos. In Sector 705, duty ng Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes na i-advance ang mga lugar na tinitirahan ng mga katutubo para maging moral, material, economic, social, and political. Ang mga development ng mga lugar na ito ay ang goal or fusion o pagsasama ng mga Kristiyano at non-Christian. The provincial governor, with the approval of the department head, has the authority to relocate non-Christian inhabitants to designated sites on unoccupied public lands. This action is permitted when deemed necessary to maintain law and order. The selected sites must also be approved by the provincial board. In Sector 2145, binigyan ng mga kapangyarihan ng provincial governor na ilipat ang mga katutubo sa mga unoccupied public lands kung sa tingin niya ay kailangan para sa law and order.
Nung umalis ang mga Amerikano, itinuloy pa rin ng gobyerno ng Pilipinas yung policy nila tungkol sa mga katutubo. On June 22, 1957, the Philippine Congress passed Republic Act No. 1888. These laws still carried with the same view that the Americans cast towards the indigenous peoples, na kung saan sinasabi nilang mababang uri ng sibilisasyon ang mga katutubo at kailangan silang isama sa nakararaming Pilipino. Sabi sa Section 1 ng Republic Act No. 1888, it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to foster, accelerate, and to accomplish by all adequate means and in systematic, rapid, and complete manner the moral, material, economic, social, and political advancement of the non-Christian Filipinos, hereinafter called national cultural minorities, and to render real, complete, and permanent the integration of all the said national cultural minorities into the body politic. Sinasabi ng batas na layunin ng Kongreso na tulungan, pabilisin, at tapusin ang pag-unlad ng moral, material, ekonomiya, sosyal, at politikal ng mga non-Christian Filipinos na tinatawag ding national cultural minorities. Gusto nilang tuluyang isama ang mga katutubo sa mainstream ng lipunan ng Pilipinas. Sabi naman sa Section 2 ng Republic Act 1888, to effectuate the said policy and to achieve the aims and objectives of this act, a commission to be known as the Commission on National Integration was created. So para magawa ito, bumuo sila ng isang komisyon na tinatawag na Commission on National Integration. Ito ang isang agency na magpapatupad ng mga programa at proyekto para sa mga katutubo. So sa madaling salita, ang Republic Act No. 1888 ay isang batas na naglalayong isama ang mga katutubo sa pangunahing lipunan ng Pilipinas. Pero may pananaw na kailangan silang iangat dahil sa paniniwalang sila ay hindi gaanong maunlad. Land tenure and ownership of national resources. Land ownership is a sensitive issue in the relationship between indigenous people and Philippine state. The document says that the history of forcibly integrating indigenous peoples is evident in the government's land ownership policies. These policies clash with indigenous peoples' ancestral claims and traditional land use. The Spanish colonizers imposed the Regalian Doctrine claiming state ownership over all lands. The Regalian Doctrine was a way for the Spanish crown to claim ownership of all lands in the Philippines. This meant that even if people had been living on and using the land for generations, if they didn't have a title recognized by the Spanish government, the land could be taken away. The doctrine was continued by the American regime and incorporated into the 1935 and 1973 Philippine constitutions. The Regalian Doctrine established by the Spanish wasn't discarded when the Americans colonized the Philippines. Instead, the American regime upheld these principles. This concept of state ownership of all land was so deeply ingrained that it was written into the fundamental laws of the land, Philippine constitutions, which stated all lands of the public domain, waters, minerals, and other natural resources belong to the state. The case of Carino versus Insular Government acknowledged immemorial use and occupation as a basis for land ownership, challenging the Regalian Doctrine. Mateo Carino and Igorot claim ownership of his land based on immemorial use and occupation. This means his argument wasn't based on a Spanish land title, but on the fact that his ancestors had been living on and using that land for so long as anyone could remember. The U.S. Supreme Court, in this case, recognized the validity of Carino's claim. It acknowledged that there were land rights that existed before any colonial government came in and that these rights should be respected.
I'm Sandra Galimba. Now I'm going to discuss the 1987 Constitution. Ang 1987 Constitution ng Pilipinas, unlike the previous Constitution, parang social contract ng mga Filipino. Kasi nga, yung mga past Constitution, either pinilit or dinaya ang pag-ratify. Kaya this time, mas na-recognize ang rights ng mga indigenous people. Nakapaloob dito ang mga artikulo na Section 22 Article 2 ng 1987 Constitution. It means that recognizes and promotes the rights ng mga indigenous cultural communities. And also nakapaloob rito ang Section 15 Article 10, nag-allow ng establishment ng autonomous regional government sa Cordillera. Then, naipasa ang IPRA or Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997. Giving legal recognition sa kanila. Nagkaroon ng debate sa definition ng indigenous peoples, especially comparing countries with European settlements at colonial states. Sa Philippines, ang IPRA nag-define ng katutubo as people with self-ascription, living in a community for a long time, with their own culture, and who registered foreign influences. At ang mga challenges na kinakaharap dito sa IPRA ay legalidad ng IPRA challenged the Supreme Court, especially ang issue ng Regalian Doctrine. Split and decision ng Supreme Court pero IPRA remained legal. Regalian Doctrine patuloy na pinanghahawakan ng court. This also included the MOAAD or Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain. It means that aiming to create the Mangsa Moro juridical entity is stopped by the Supreme Court kasi daw it violates the territorial integrity ng Pilipinas. Next slide is the conclusion. Ang sinasabi lang dito, before the government thought indigenous people or IPs were less civilized, so they tried to make them modern by forcing them to integrate or assimilate into the mainstream Filipino culture.